Hi, all.
Morning or evening, depending on where you are.
Kind of in between. How are you doing, Alex?
Doing all right. How about yourself?
Good. Good, thank you. Everybody's having fun with time zone changes and meeting calendar changes.
Apparently.
Every time.
Yeah.
I don't know why they don't get rid of them. I mean,
yeah, it's crazy. Yes, I agree.
Hello, friends.
hello,
Hello,
Link.
hello. How's it going?
Not too bad. Sorry for being a minute or two late here.
It's all good.
Just going to get some stuff set up here. Benji, you'll be happy to hear that I set up our live notes doc in advance of the meeting starting this week. It finally sunk in.
Awesome.
Getting my agenda file up and running. Do we have any open PRs? I don't think we do. Fantastic.
Yeah, I just opened a new PR.
You did.
Yeah.
I'll keep
And
my eye out
the-
for them as they come. I'll add you, Yvonne. Thanks for doing that. Cool. Merged. If anybody else isn't on the attendees list yet, this is a long attendees list. It's like we got 19 people on the call today. Part of me was thinking like last meeting of the year, it's going to be thin, but dang, I think we're going to run out of time.
I think so.
we got a lot of stuff to cover today. We'll do our best to stay on time and hopefully get to everything in the agenda. But if we have to bump something to next month, might be a rare case where we have to do that. Anyhow, in the spirit of that, let's get started. Welcome everybody to December 2021 edition of our working group meeting. By joining, of course, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. There are links to all of those in the agenda should you ever want to remind yourself what those are. As per usual, we do around the room of introducing ourselves. Since there's a lot of people on the call today, rather than saying what you do and what you work on, let's just do name to a face. We'll do the order that they appear in the agenda doc. So take a look at that, see your name coming, and try to be ready to unmute yourself. So that way everyone can have a name to a face. So I'm at the top of that list, so I'll introduce myself first. Hello, everyone. My name is Lee. Joey, you're next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe.
Is Alexander here? Oh, you're muted, Alex.
Hi, my name is Alex. Hi.
Hi guys, I'm Michael.
Hello, I'm Mark.
Nice mic, Mark. I don't know that I see a drone here yet. Nor Gabe. Or Oleg for that matter. So Matt, you're next.
All right. Hi, I'm Matt.
Hello, I'm Sahaj.
Alex.
Rob.
Benji.
Liz.
I'm Alan.
Aloha, I'm Hugh.
Yakov is not here yet either.
Hi, I'm Rob.
No face for me today, but I'm Sasha.
I'm Morris.
I'm one.
All right. Welcome all, faceless and faced. That serves as a very good sound check for everyone, at least. And it was probably the fastest attendee intro we've done yet, despite having a lot of people here. So thank you all for that. I see no pencil marks in our list of attendees. I know Benji always has a virtual pencil mark next to his name, but we do have a lot of folks. We do have a lot to talk about. So if anyone is willing to pop open that live Google Doc, everyone should have edit access. And please help out with taking notes, especially as Benji is live in discussion. That would be super helpful. Okay, let's take a quick look over our agenda, make sure we've got everything we want to talk about. We are going to talk about previous meeting action items. I'll give a very brief update on Tsc Elections and where we are with that. And then we will get into the good stuff. We have shorthand for variables and arguments, client-controlled nullability update, defer stream updates, and discussing GraphQL mutation design with large schemas, and applying directives on directives. It's a lot of stuff. Anything else that we want to talk about today? Awesome. Okay.
Can I ask a question, Lee?
Please do so.
Yeah, so I'm new. I've got ideas, and I know that you have to go through this very, very heavy RFC process to get them to be discussed here. What's the right way to have like a seed idea just before I go marching on the RFC thing, just to like throw it out and say, what do you guys think? Is this crazy? Should I put all my effort into it?
Actually,
that's a great question.
As well be my question too. So I'm new here as well.
Welcome to both of you. Glad you're here. Great question. So we have these RFC stages that basically identify where in the life cycle an idea is, where you'll see sort of RFC 2 or 3 is like very close to bulletproof, if not bulletproof. RFC 1 is, we generally agree that this is a thing that we want to pursue, but it may be in a partially complete state. That's where most RFCs spend most of their life cycle. And then RFC 0 is crazy idea. We can create as many RFC 0s as we want. And in fact, that's exactly the right way to talk about this stuff. And it gives you some surface area to write these out in whatever form is helpful for you. So if you want to explore that via a code pull request, if you want to explore that via just opening an issue or a discussion, now that we have the discussions tab on GitHub Live, or in the GraphQL working group GitHub, we have a directory called RFCs, and it's totally acceptable to add RFC zeros there as well. You'll find a bunch of docs there that are in various states of usefulness or abandonment, and it's just a shared space for us to put stuff. So I would say for an RFC 0, whatever you find most helpful to get the idea out. I find it best to try to generate some asynchronous discussion on that first, just to get a sense of if it has legs, or if anyone can raise up, was this talked about in the past? Are there, primary points that you want to get ahead of before you bring it to discussion here. And then that way, when you do bring it to an agenda item for this meeting, you already kind of know what you want feedback on and where you want to dig in with the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh,
Absolutely.
Just a quick, because like Alexander, I commented a little bit on your PR into the working group. Like a PR that you make to the working group RFC can definitely be like way less involved. Like everything that you put in the like you could make an RFC 0 that is literally just like the link to your slideshow and the link to your like description.
No, I'm fine
document.
wherever it lives. I didn't put it intentionally in my GitHub. I just didn't know where to put it. So
no, I guess my point is like we shouldn't think of making RFCs as a heavyweight process. Ideally, like making an RFC 0, we want that to be as lightweight as possible. And if it is viewed as heavyweight, let us know like what we can do to reduce that, because having a just like ability for people to throw out ideas is really important, and doing it in a way where we can generate discussion even outside the context.
Yeah, that's the goal as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally agree. Yeah, the goal here is that the heavyweightedness of the process for RFCs scales up as the maturity of the RFC scales up. So like as you get closer to stage 2 and stage 3, like we get very detailed about making sure that it's the right thing to ship. But like in stage 0 and 1, it's very exploratory and high level, and like whatever information we have is great. It's like the goal is just to make sure the discussion stays on focus.
So my understanding is this is sort of a kickoff for ideas or place to kick them off. Where do they continue these discussions? Do we wait for the next working group meeting, or do we have the means to discuss them offline, if you wish?
Both. Either can work. It kind of depends on the time availability, what you need to do, what the next steps are. Sometimes we can make a lot of progress async between meetings and use these meetings as a way to get everybody else on the same page about what's happened. For some of our more complicated RFCs, we found having a breakout group of a subset of this room meet, maybe still monthly, but like at the halfway point between these is helpful as like a check-in and make sure that progress is being resolved. It kind of depends. And again, it's whatever process is the right balance between what's helpful for the RFC and what people are willing to put into it.
Yeah, cool.
Good question. I have one small thing to add that I didn't think to put on the agenda. It's just a super brief update, which is this was the last agenda doc that we had in our folder. So I went ahead in the hour before the meeting and I just put together a bunch of them for 2022. So just wanted to let y'all know that those are out. Same time guidelines, we can always discuss changing that, but I figured might as well have them up there. And then later, if we decide that we want to tweak any calendar timings, we can do that later. Two small things that I did that hopefully will be helpful. I put these in a 2022 directory. I might back propagate that and try to take the existing ones and put them in directories and figure out how to make sure I don't break old links in the process. We're 4.5 years into this meeting. That's crazy. And so the list of agenda files is getting really long, which is congrats to the set of folks who have been around for the long term in this room. But time to add a tier to our organization. The other thing I did is I cleaned up the template a bit so that when you actually see the markdown rendered, you just kind of see the good stuff and a lot less of the guidelines and all of the stuff in between. And I pulled all of that up to a comment block above it so that when you go to either edit the file or send a pull request, you will first see that and it's a little bit more spelled out. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look over that, I don't know, making sure I didn't misspell anything or if something's confusing, feel free to let me know. If you want to send a pull request to one file, I'll make sure I propagate it to all the other ones. Okay, let's do a quick look at previous meeting action items. Thank you to Benji, who I see most of these, for filling a bunch of these in. Since we're on a bit of a tight schedule today, we're just going to look at ready for reviews, but I do have the links up here in case anyone wants to go look at all of the open action items. We've got 4 that are ready for review. I'm going to go through these in bottoms up order if you're looking at that link. So Slack to Discord, assign relevant permissions. Yep, done. We are live on Discord. Second one, apply for Vanity URL. Did we do this? Ready for review?
Yes, so we've applied, we've heard nothing, but there's not really anything we can do. It's like a GitHub issue that has been filed. I've linked to it.
Okay.
But yeah, unless anyone knows someone at Discord that can, bump it up the priority list, I think we're just stuck waiting. But also, as I put in that issue, I don't think it really matters because we've got discord.graphql.org now. So we don't really need a discord.gg/GraphQL as well.
Totally agree. Sweet, closed. Move the RFCs to the working group repo, update all relevant READMEs. Did I update the READMEs? Yeah, I see your comment here, Benji. You're not certain if that was also done. Let's go ahead and close this. I suspect that since updating READMEs is not super crispy on whether or not we know that's done or not, this may be a long tail of finding dead links and updating them along the way. I hope that there aren't that many, but if anyone spots a dead link, please send a pull request to fix it. Since I know a handful of folks are new here, just to overview what we did. We used to have all of our working files in the GraphQL Spec repo, and this GraphQL working group repo, GraphQL-WG repo, was only for hosting the agenda docs and notes for this meeting. That ended up being a problem for the last round of the spec cut when we were trying to get a clear sense of who was committing what, when, and like had they signed the appropriate agreements. Basically, we need tighter permissions on the spec repo itself compared to this one. And that had a practical cost to people's ability to merge stuff. We wanted to make sure that the bar for merging into the spec repo was quite high. And therefore, we wanted to limit the set of people who had commit rights to that repo. But the GraphQL WG repo, the goal is to actually have relatively broad commit rights. Basically, of course, the Tsc has commit rights, but the hope is that a lot of just long-term members who show up to this meeting regularly, we can trust to give commit rights. That way, anyone who just shows up, this also going back to our conversation earlier about sending RFC docs, if you send a pull request to that RFC doc, we should just kind of like broadly approve those and merge them. There's no real reason to like have review at the PR level. The goal is actually to just get the information in. And so what we did is we took all the spec PR docs or the RFC docs and we moved them into this repo. So likely a bunch of stuff broke along the way. Anyhow, issue closed.
On a related topic, is it okay to start like merging typos and stuff like that into the GraphQL spec repo again now that the October release is out?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good. Anything that's like a plainly obvious editorial change, yeah, we can merge, like a spelling mistake. Last one on here is this nominations. I'm going to leave this issue open despite being ready for a review, just because it's a good place to capture all the information about what's happening until the entire election process is complete. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to edit it from nominations to elections. Now it's a little bit more clear that it's about that. And I'll remove this ready for review label. And that is a good segue into our next topic anyhow. Any other questions about open action items?
Where is this list that you're reading from?
Great question. In the agenda doc, I think it is agenda number 5, review previous meeting action items. 2 links there. Ready for review is the link that I had popped open and was working through. Should show 0 now that we've just gone through them all. There's a second link there, which is all open action items, which You'll notice that there's a lot of them that were open in the last few days, which is, again, huge thanks to Benji, who reviewed over our note stocks from the last couple meetings and opened issues for everything we said should be in action.
Yeah, it's 5 months worth. Sorry about that.
No, thank you.
It's a service you provide, Benji, that's for sure. Okay, good segue into our next topic, which is the update on the Tsc elections. That was the last open action item that we just looked at. For folks who are new, just a super quick overview of what this is. We have our Tsc. It is 11 folks, that is me plus 10 others. And every year, half of those 10 go up for elections. So their seats expire, and then we have an elections process to fill them. We had a nominations process. I tweeted about this a couple of times. I've had this issue open since late October, and we've collected a bunch of names into a form. I think at this point we have a little over 10, maybe a dozen. I'll have to ask Brian, our PM, how many names we've got. Anyhow, our nominations officially closed on the 29th. Brian set up the timing here to have a couple of days between the 29th and the 1st so that he could prep some elections material for the remainder of the Tsc. And the next step, which I don't think we've actually kicked off, even though this says on the 1st, we will kick this off. I'll actually drop a note to Brian to help us get this started. The next phase is the remaining Tsc, so the set of Tsc whose seats are not up, that are not expiring and up for election, will review the folks who've submitted their name, and we'll take a vote. So that has not happened yet, but that will happen between now and the end of the year, hopefully a little bit sooner. That way I can post the outcomes of that process, which means we will have a new set of Tsc members by our next meeting, January 6th. That's the goal. So that is a quick update. Anyone have questions? Thanks
Is
everyone
is that taking place over the Tsc mailing list?
Yes. We might do it on a GitHub discussion or something, and then just like hit every channel to make sure people find it. Brian and I will figure out what's going to be the most helpful place to put that. But yeah, we'll definitely drop a note on the mailing list. We'll probably ping everyone individually to make sure everyone's got this info.
Cool.
All right, on to the good stuff. Sahaj, the first or the next agenda item is yours. Shorthand for variable and arguments.
Yeah, so this is a spec proposal. So right now, if you open up that issue, should I share my screen?
Sure.
Good. Am I sharing the right one? Okay. So at the Guild, we have found while working with clients that like when you're writing a query, right? So you have like you define your query and then it's almost the same variable names we use. So it's like if you need a user from ID, you do ID and then you pass that variable name down. So with this proposal, it's kind of like the JavaScript syntax where it's kind of like it's a shorthand for variables. So instead of doing ID, repeating it, if we can just do $ID in the query when you're executing it. So like for JavaScript objects, if you have a variable called foo and you want to set a key foo in an object, you can just do like foo, and this is equivalent to this. So similarly for variable names, if we can have something like just passing the variable name and it translates back to whatever the argument is. Yeah, that's any thoughts, suggestions? How should we go about it?
Thanks for the clearly written proposal. Yeah, anyone have any early thoughts?
I think it could be nice, but I think it has to be weighed against what syntax might this prevent later. The same applies to my recommendation, by the way. So I have a number of ideas there that affect syntax, and the fear is in both cases that it might actually prevent us from doing something better later.
Okay.
Yep. I just sent a link in the chat to our guiding principles, which are always a helpful lens for looking at new ideas and seeing how we want to think about them. And what you just expressed, I think, is a great example of preserving option value. Is this a change that may hurt future option value? I don't want to take that principle to an extreme that limits our ability to make any change. Although certainly changes to the syntax itself should have a fairly high bar compared to other kinds of changes we might consider because of this issue. So maybe what might be helpful is just doing a brainstorm of wild ideas, syntax ideas that this could potentially conflict with, just so that we have an understanding of slightly more concretely what our lost options could contain. I think it's a very reasonable concern to raise. I just want to get a better understanding of what that might look like.
I think more thinking is required. I don't know whether we can do that thinking right now. How does this interact with other inputs or arguments that might be combined with it? What happens in the case of clash? How do we indicate? This is a problem that I have as well in my proposal. How do we indicate to the client that this syntax is actually fine, that they can use it? Because that's another thing. If you're running this against older servers, they will not know this. If you're running this against new servers, they will. Federation needs to understand how to handle this. So there's trouble in that respect. And I tried to solve my own problem in some ways, throw some ideas, but it's certainly something that we need to think about whenever syntax is involved.
Yeah, that last point is one that is, I would say, an unsolved problem for GraphQL right now is, given a particular server, do you know its total feature set, what it does and doesn't support? There have been lightweight proposals on how to solve that in the past. I don't think we've ever had something compelling enough that we've gone through it yet. I understand in practice what a lot of people do is they either have documentation around it per server, or they just try it and it fails and then they understand why, which is of course not ideal. It is what it is.
It's regarding syntax, but
yeah,
I think a lot of things can be tested with directives, like looking, does the server has certain directives, and then you expect certain functionality.
Yeah, I think so that these server features, or whatever they end up being called, I mean, in my presentation, I have some, not recommendations, some ideas, crazy ideas, let's call them that, RFC zeros, that are based on directives. But somebody has to make a decision. Do we want like individual directives for individual things, or do we want one directive that has that is sort of parameterized and can say, well, this feature, that feature, and whatnot, what's available, what's not. And then there's the question that I faced when I was thinking about these things. When we have Apollo guys here, right? I'm not a user of Apollo Federation, but I'm thinking of becoming one later, or enabling my GraphQL APIs to be federable. And the question is, what if you need to federate a server that does have this and the server that doesn't? So it's no longer a feature. Like, how does federation present itself? It's not that it has it everywhere. It's that it has it either some features might be available only somewhere, or it has to have the ability to implement them somehow otherwise, and so on and so on. It becomes an interesting question in itself that way.
Just to clarify, from like actual proposal that Sahaj proposing, is like IST based fully. So like it will work basically like if proxy supports, it's supported. So if Apollo Federation can parse this thing, it's like generate queries and send them. Like one small consideration, if you generate queries, maybe like have a flag that disable like shorthand, automatic shorthand, to like if you want to be sure that all servers support them. Yeah, like I think we should separate like IST based syntax based features from other features. I'm like also not sure if we should support like new language features and queries. One thing I want to remind, we actually have a precedent. Not a lot of people using it, but like block strings, technically you can use them inside queries. I don't think like a lot of people using them, but technically we have precedent. This thing, it's more like involved, because printer, like stuff that will print IST, by default it should do shorthand, because we try to use like syntax feature we have. So it will, like newer version of GraphQL libraries will generate by default, they will generate like queries incompatible with old servers. This is like an issue for this particular proposal. But I would separate like deep features that involve like whole GraphQL from like syntax-based one.
Yeah. Just now having reviewed over these guiding principles again, a lot of these are helping us understand cost. I think like, so favor no change, obviously we're making a change. So I think like the way to interpret that is we should have a very high bar of added value. And then the burden of proof here is on the proposal. So, and then also we want to make sure that we are being motivated by real use cases. I understand that we are. This is a consequence of the guild working with a bunch of folks and seeing common patterns. I suspect what might be a helpful next step is to better articulate the positive case. I think we, at this point, have a pretty good understanding of the cost. Anytime you change syntax, there's ripple effects across the whole ecosystem. There's concerns about option value. I have concerns about, one of our principles is simplicity is more important than expressiveness. Like the fact that you have to say, I have an argument called X whose value is the variable $X. Like that is long, but it is self-descriptive in a way that just $X alone implies something that may be non-obvious to someone new to GraphQL. So it's like, there's a lot of costs here. And I think what we need to do is a cost benefit analysis. And the next step there is better understanding the benefit. Like how painful is not having this? Is this a nice to have, or is this like truly a very real developer experience improvement?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because it's the improvement that this will give us worth sacrificing that it might not work with older servers and stuff like that. And also, I think if we just put the ID in there, it's not clear, is it a positional parameter? Is it inferring the name, depending on from where you look at it? It loses clarity, but yeah.
My suspicion is that the action item we should take on this is explicitly like on the proposal, do the cost benefit, make sure that we have a place for discussion, the people that, make sure we clarify, hey, here are the downsides, exactly as you described, Michael. and like what are the upsides, what are the motive, like just having read through it today, I'm not totally clear what the motivating use cases are yet. So yeah, I think it's clear this is still, like, as an action item, this is still RFC 0, but worth like putting down all of the details.
Agreed. That's a great action item to take. Cost benefit analysis has happened on this issue thread. I did add the RFC 0 label, so that's where this is. I think that's like understanding the outcome of that cost benefit analysis will let us know whether we want to pursue this and take it to 1 or do something else. Joe, you want to ask that question?
Yeah, no, I'm loving this discussion. This, like, I have an idea. I'll wait. I'll do the process, but I would love to get it in this same forum for the same discussion. How do I get my RFC onto the agenda?
Great question. All you got to do is send a pull request.
Oh, and one of you guys will say, "Okay, I see it," and we'll just put it on there, like first in.
Yeah, we tend to blindly merge pull requests to the agenda, assuming that you've signed the CLA. Which, because you're here, you very likely have already done that. So yeah, anything you want to put up for discussion here, you're welcome to do.
Great. I'm pretty excited about this.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this? We have hit just a little bit over the 10-minute mark, which is what we asked for here. Any other thoughts here, or should we move on? Cool. Alex, I'll hand it to you.
Sweet. I'll try to keep the discussion brief this time. So I want to give an update on where we're at with the implementation of the proposal, and then just a little extra. One moment. Cool. So in the spec PR, there was discussion about, it's cool if I share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. We wanted a way to mark list elements required. I think it was Lee who suggested this syntax, and then someone else said they liked it, and then no one else had any objections to it. So I implemented this. This is working now. The tests are passing. It's wonderful. Ivan gave me an architectural review on the implementation. It was super helpful, cleaned up a lot of stuff. My stuff is up for review again. There was some discussion last time on what the question mark operator should do. I don't want to get into it too deeply now because I feel like that it'll go on for a while. But just brief overview of what was suggested. The question mark operator currently takes something that is non-nullable and converts it to be nullable. So if null is returned for a field marked to the question mark operator, it won't propagate null to the parent. It'll just come back null. There will be no error. But it was suggested that it could be used as sort of an error boundary, like the catch in a try catch. One of the things that came up was that the exclamation point right now, if something comes back null and then null propagates, it'll come back as an error. And some smart clients will just blow out the entire response if there's any errors. So it suggested that using a question mark could indicate that errors were handled and that we shouldn't blow out the entire thing. I don't remember if it was Ivan or someone else who also suggested that if we did that, if an error was handled, we could also hold the unmodified return stuff in the error type, so that some clients could look at the errors and do interesting things with them, treat it as like a non-destructive action, and some could treat it as a destructive action. It would kind of be up to them. There were some other suggestions too. We didn't really land on one, but I would like to figure out a way to come to some sort of consensus before the next working group meeting. I'm doing this for work, and I'm going to have less time to work on this next quarter. So if we can get to stage 2 by the next working group meeting, that would be ideal for me. So like what can I do to help us come to a consensus on what we want to do with this?
Great work, by the way. You made a ton of progress since the last meeting, and I'm super excited about this proposal at this point. So again, hugely great work. I think our next step, given we have more questions than answers or suggestions for how to handle the question mark operator. I'm absolutely convinced that we need it, and we have to choose one of these semantics. But I think the next step is to list out like option A, option B, option C, like what do they look, basically like bifurcate, like fork, and then like in option A, like this is how the spec would look, this is how the rules would work, here's the pros and cons, and then do that for each of the paths that we want to consider, and use it to like spitball some ideas a little bit, and either then conclude that some of those paths are non-viable. Okay. Or like whittle it down to, like, if it whittles down to 1, great. Like you can come back and say like, hey, I put a ton of energy into teasing out what the right thing is to do, and now I'm confident that this is the one that is the right thing to do. And if it's more than one, then that's okay. Then you can, async, just like start tagging folks who've been active on this thread before and start pulling input. And then hopefully by the time we come back to the January meeting, we've got like a concrete discussion to have.
Gotcha. Okay. I went through the previous working group meeting and dumped people's comments into this thread, and like tagged the people responsible for them. So some of them are here. I can try to clean these up and make it a little more clear what the difference is between these different options. And then I think Lee, you had a use case around what you're doing at Robinhood, and I'd like some more details on that. So I have you tagged here. And then Benji had some thoughts, but he didn't. He said he wanted some time to write them down. So I'd like to get those as well. Yeah.
As somebody who, oh, sorry, go ahead.
And I just want to say also before we move that up. So I'm also super excited about this, but I would like to implement that at least in our server. I mean, is it already implemented in Graphql Js, so that we have a couple of implementations we can play with and see also when playing with it how this feels before moving it to stage 2.
You already have an implementation for this?
No, I would. I will do that maybe over Christmas, but I would want the time to have an implementation running before rushing it to because I'm really very, very excited about the feature, but I want to also have a feeling about where the edge is here. I mean, we also implemented Deferred stream, and it's still stage 1. And we're finding new things every day in the discussions. So it's worth first implementing that in at least 1 or 2 implementations apart from Graphql Js.
Michael, there's an open PR against Graphql Js that Alex has written and is linked in the one of the line links in the agenda is his PR. Go take a look at that. I've only given it a quick overview, but Yvonne and Sahaj have both given it relatively detailed feedback so far. So it's fully complete. Like you should be able to patch that PR and have a functioning version that completely implements what Alex has proposed so far. The question mark operator, including, by the way, his recent changes to the syntax that he just talked about, he already added those in. There's still, of course, the question of like how we want the question mark operator to work. So he's picked the one that he started with there. We got to work through that. But like in terms of this, the point you made is a good one. It's part of the reason why, we only want to move things to stage 2 once we have at least one implementation, at least at the PR phase, like mostly complete. for exactly the reason you described. Like it helps us shake out other issues by like actually writing unit tests against them.
Yeah. We're working on on integrating with the Guild's code generator. What client do you use?
So I'm building a backend essentially. I'm working on the .NET implementation. And we implement really everything very early. We start in stage 2, in stage 1, when the discussions are on, but it's good to find also the edges that you might have in non-JavaScript servers. We are one, also in non-JavaScript clients. So we are also building a .NET client to see what problems we get into with static languages and stuff like that, just to wiggle out some edges. And we found in the past when we did that, like with Defer, that there's still a lot of discussion points that we have. And I think that will bring quite a good feedback.
Yeah, and I know that you've been in contact with Jordan Eldridge a lot on this, but as an example of what would, like, at least me personally, what would make me confident that we can like push this through more quickly is if it's very clear you and he are presenting like a unified front of what needs to happen. Given he has the most, like he's the one who implemented it for Facebook, or implemented @required for Facebook, and has dealt with all of the product usages and like is at the forefront of support issues with it. Like having somebody in that position advocating for the same path is very strong, like is a very strong argument.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I know you've already been doing that. I'm just like, want to reiterate, like, given you want to move quickly, I think that that's like a faster path to move quickly.
Okay.
I'll just contribute this much. I wanted to read all the proposals, I didn't. So I don't know enough about this one, but it does tickle my mind, and it did. I'll have to think more about it. What does this mean for the server? What does this mean? What do you want back? I didn't read that much. When you want something not null and it is null, what do you expect server to do? To exclude it? Is that the type of filtering, or is that what?
Essentially on the, go ahead.
Oh, it treats the field the same as if it was marked non-nullable in the schema itself. So it would propagate null to the nearest parent and return it.
So what we implemented in we just did the first preparing steps for that. So when we built the query execution plan for the essentially executing the GraphQL query, we have written the types actually on the selection, so we are not referring to the field. And on the selection, we can then rewrite the type to non-nullable or null, and then you have the error behavior as if it were the field type. So that you either if you make a nullable field non-null, then actually the query might be erased. You have this non-null erasure, or if you take it away, you don't have that non-null erasure. With that, you can do.
It sounds a little bit like criteria. I mean, in my implementation, it would have to turn that into a criteria because it might be too late, especially if you're considering deferring stream. If you get stuff before you get to this, and then this says, oops, there's a null that I don't want. I should not have sent you that one because that one needs to be null too, and so on and so on. Gets into tricky situations possibly. But I don't want to spend time on that necessarily now. It's just something to think about.
Yvonne, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, actually, like it's remind me interesting idea. Maybe as part of RFC process, we need to cut like timestamp from previous working group meetings so people can like watch watch it and like we have faster discussion. People can be up to speed faster if we attach like timestamps. Why I raised a hand, I have like actual suggestion because I think it's like with feature, at least like what Alex currently plan is to like support through ecosystem, and this feature started as like for client generation, feature for client generation. So I think instead of like going back and forth, theoretically we can implement it as an experimental feature. Previously, we did like some experimental features like query variables and fragments and some other stuff. So my personal, so like idea, can we merge it into Graphql Js under a flag? What we discussed for stream and defer. And for stream and defer, like I choose, I think looking back, I choose like best strategy of having separate like release. But for this feature, like can we merge it under experimental flag? Entire ecosystem will experiment with it. We will learn we'll learn stuff on actual experience of using it as a way forward.
That sounds reasonable to me, and I defer to your judgment and other folks working at Graphql Js. You know, usually the only reason why we would hesitate is if we were worried that people will over rely on it or that it might cause some other problem. Basically, we should assume that it will dramatically change, and if that breaks anyone, then we should wait. But if putting it behind a flag alleviates that concern, then great. I think merging this and then patching in changes along the way as we figure out the remaining open issues seems totally viable to me.
Yeah, my personal criteria for experimental feature, if we have active champion behind it, because if we have active champion, we'll either like merge it or it will be rejected and we can remove it. The worst case scenario, if like we had something as experimental and it's there for like years without any progress. So Alex is pretty active, so it's like check the same with Rob on stream and defer, a lot of progress, a lot of iteration. So I think it would be helpful for everybody. Yeah, one thing we need to have discussion how to mark experimental features. Basically, what's the proper way? Yeah.
But
JS.
I have another question on the stage, because is there a reason to? Is it just that you don't have time to spend on it? Why you want to get it very quickly to stage 2? Because I mean, you can already. I mean, we are having stream and defer in Hot Chocolate for now quite a long time, and everybody can use it. You just have to switch a flag on, and then the server supports it.
Yeah, just to clarify, so idea is not to move it to stage 2. Idea is to keep it stage 1, but merge it in actual implementation. Because like what happened with stream defer is like it's PR on GraphQL. Like ecosystem will, if idea is compelling and if there is like active push for it, people will implement it anyway, but implement it in multiple ways. What happening with stream defer? So like right now it's released as separate release. So
stream defer is different because we didn't have the spec proposal. Actually, the implementation that you meant, the variations, they came up before we had a spec. Essentially, everything was based on Lee's presentation at Graphql React Europe in 2016, I think. And we also did that. But I think since we have the spec proposal, there's a lot of push in the ecosystem there is Meros, it's a client that handles the protocol and stuff like that. So there's a lot of alignment now. Like Relay has to catch up still. The initial count, for instance, has some differences to the spec proposal, but it's coming together. So if there's a spec proposal, you won't have these variations because people follow them. So I don't have a concern. I mean, if a PR is good, we should move it, but we shouldn't just rush it because of time concerns.
Yeah. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm not. I don't want to, move something to stage 2 that shouldn't be stage 2. What I'm looking for is just, if we can speed up iteration time, if I can get feedback a little quicker. That sort of thing.
I definitely will do implementation for our server over Christmas, and then I have some feedback also.
Okay.
To clarify a bit, why I are going for leaving in stage 1, but have an under experimental flag. Like Rob give a talk about stream and defer on like various conferences, and like in his talk he said like you need to use that release, apply that PR. It's like for people to actually try this feature, it's not like flicking one switch. It's like using PR on different PR or different releases on different projects, which is like a lot of troubles. Like about JavaScript ecosystem, I want to have like one switch in one place. You flick it and you allow this. You can use this feature. You don't do custom builds, custom packages. Like Alex created previously a custom package for this feature. I want to prevent that basically. So allow people to try it more easily.
Yeah, I do understand that, but I'm just from the experience, we see these iterations are going on stream and defer. We are still finding things where we didn't think about. Like there is today we have the issue with the scalar lists, which can be deferrable and stuff like that. And sometimes it takes time, these discussions, to get the feature right.
Feature is exactly for that. It's like even for they not even like they're not stable by the nature. Like we can remove them, we can change them. It's like everybody understand, everybody on the same page. It's experimental. So
okay. Yeah, I don't want to block it, but I don't want to go to the next stage too early with these things, because if we have major changes, because we then find out it doesn't work out in this part. For instance, by stream and defer, we still have to discuss the payloads a bit.
Clarify. Imagine it is experimental, doesn't change like spec process, so it will continue to be PR.
Okay. So you're not talking about moving it to stage 2. Because for me stage 2 is we are just refining little edges maybe.
Yeah, it's like keeping stage 1, but imagine it's experimental flag. For example, we have query variables on fragments, which is not, I think like Matt have proposal about it, but it's like strawman, and we like discussed it one time, but it's under experimental flag in weird state. So like it happened before, and like we didn't have any like major problem with it.
Yeah, this is higher justification for being under an experimental flag than even the fragment variables does. So I don't think that is like, if you're using something in Graphql Js that's under an experimental flag, like the expectation is it might break for you on the next release. You're like on the bleeding edge. You're not, it's not stage 2 things. It's like truly, yeah.
Yeah, and even for people reviewing the code, like last time when Matt had query variables, every line that touches it says it's experimental. In IST definition said it's experimental. It's like experimental flag says experimental. So even person reading the code and not seeing like top level experimental flag, he like for sure, even like inside the parser, it's written like this path is experimental. So it's like super clear.
I think this works for me. I think I'm fine with that, with the experimental setup. My thinking, and I'm gonna have time next quarter to work on this a little bit, but my thinking was that there will be the most work to do during stage 2, and then or during stage 1, and then after, once I hit stage 2, then it'll be, like you said, small refinements, and then it'll be further in between. So like I allocated a full quarter for this this quarter, but next quarter I'll have, you know, like a few weeks.
Yeah, and I didn't want to just hold it up, so I just want to have time to that we don't rush things through.
No, I totally understand.
Yep, sounds good. Well, let's wrap this one up since we're a little bit over the requested time. But just to round things out, sounds like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
One real quick thing I forgot. A choice I made. There was also a question of for the. Does the number of dimensions in a list need to match for the non-null designator and the type? And I've made it so that it has to match. You can't go fewer than the number of dimensions. If we want to loosen that later, I think we can in a non-breaking way. So I just put that restriction in. Sorry.
Very interesting. Cool. Well, it sounds like we know the criteria for 2 is that we have identified and then resolved all of the concerns and challenges. Sounds like there's the main one we just talked about, which is what to do about the question mark operator, and then a couple minor ones, which is around getting feedback on this last round of syntax that you've changed. Seems super viable that we can give you feedback between now and the end of the year for that, so that you can take some action and make some stuff happen. And then hopefully phase 3 is actually fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of getting the spec text in the right spot, which I'm happy to help you with.
Okay.
Again, thanks for your hard work on this. Great progress.
Sweet. Thanks for all the feedback. Appreciate it.
All right. Next up, Rob, to give us an update on Defer and Stream.
Just before we do that, Ivan raised a good point just now of putting the timestamps into the notes. This is something I keep forgetting to do. So if anyone notices that I've not put a timestamp in for a while, please either go ahead and do that or just like nudge me. Thanks.
Thanks for that. All right, Rob, it's all yours.
Yeah, so I spent some time recently. I set up a repo Defer Stream working group where basically added a discussion topic there for pretty much almost everything that I can remember that we've discussed, just so to keep things organized for myself and for other discussions that happen. And I marked a lot of them as resolved, things that I think that we're all aligned on. The ones that are not are listed here, and there's a few that I want to go over where I think that I have like a pretty good idea of what we should do and want to see if we're all aligned on that. So the first one I'm going to put in the chat is enforcing the correct delivery order of payloads. This is something that we talked about a few meetings ago. So I have a bunch of examples here, and I want to go through each of them one by one and say what I've implemented and if we all agree on that direction. So the first one is like the kind of classic example. So you have a deferred fragment that has another deferred fragment inside of it.
Are you meant to be sharing your screen?
I can, but I'm looking at the doc that I posted in the chat.
Oh, sorry. It just, you were talking as if you were showing us something. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, yeah, I'll share though. can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this first example, we have a deferred fragment that has some fields that are not deferred, and then another object with a deferred fragment inside of there. And the issue is that if this, in the example, if this homeworld field takes longer to resolve than species and title, then you would receive a payload that in the path is referencing a deeply nested field that hasn't been returned in any prior payloads. So, so I did some work on this and have it so that in this case, the server will know that this other fragment is a parent of that one, and it will get held up so that this doesn't happen. The next example is where the fields are nested, but there isn't another child object in the hierarchy. And so because of the way that the collect fields algorithm works, that all of these fields are kind of treated on the same level. So in this case, it would be possible to receive them where the payload for nested fragment could be returned before the payload for top fragment. So now this other example is kind of like, what if you have like an unrelated field that has this species field object, which then, since it's not deferred, would be coming back before the other one. But in this case, it's not, I don't think that it's trivial for the executor to understand like the whole tree of dependencies. So this nested fragment still would get held up until after the top fragment is returned. Last one is just kind of the same thing could happen when you have a stream nested in a defer. And so in that case, we do want the stream payload to come back after the deferred fragment, because otherwise it would again be referring to a field that's not there. And then the last one is just saying that in a stream list, like they should come back in the same order as the index. You shouldn't get the first index before the 0th index. So I guess any thoughts on that?
This last one seems plainly non-controversial. I would be extremely confused if I had an ordered stream and got the data out of order. So that seems to make sense. Maybe it'd be helpful to like, it's nice to have these examples, but like, is there a unifying principle or constraint that describes them? Like I might like reframe this last one of like, rather than saying they should not be sent out of order, payload N is dependent on payload N minus 1 being delivered, right? Like that's the constraint. Like if I was going to build a task dependency or promise dependency, like I would link, you know, next payload to previous payload. And is this a similar constraint for the previous set of examples? The merge path. So you in the payload you have path, and it's like the guarantee is that you have some like that path exists in the accumulation of previous payloads. That path exists, and like that's the dependency.
Yeah, I think it fits in, I think, with the way that the algorithm is written in the spec for collecting fields. And I haven't done it yet, but I plan on like describing it that way in the spec, because that's also how it's implemented in the code as well. But yeah, I'll definitely do that in the like actual spec edits.
I'm curious if that constraint is too simplistic or doesn't hold. Like I'm trying to follow along with your examples. Some of these are, there's a lot of moving parts to them. Are there cases where that constraint alone is not enough to describe the behavior that you might see? Like you would see a fragment getting.
I don't see a problem. I see this as a convenience feature, and somebody just has to decide essentially let's put it this way. I am not aware of the reason why an able client would not be able to handle out of order streams incorrectly. However, that would bring complexity to the client. So this is a decision as to where do we put the complexity? Is it server who's responsible for this, or is it not? And the only other thing that I can come up with is if we put this and nail it down in the spec, you or we are preventing able clients from perhaps squeezing out a little bit more of performance out of the server, because it's causing delays on the server side and buffering on the server side.
Just to clarify this a little bit, we've already established that existing clients, due to any client that basically parses responses into a graph format on the client before allowing people to access them, is essentially incapable of handling. And there's a lot of clients like that. Relay is like a very clear example of this, but basically cannot handle paths that don't yet exist in the response. So there is a dependency with existing clients, which was the motivating.
May I ask the question, how would those clients ever use a deferral? Because until they actually receive everything, there will be something incomplete.
No, they just
patch.
need the. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they can patch. So Relay, essentially, that's also why we have these markers, these label markers for the relays to know which segment they are using essentially. But it works. I mean, Relay is the first client who really implemented it, so that's where the concept is actually coming from.
Right.
There's another aspect to performance here, which is actually like the order in which you put these things on the network can matter when your bandwidth is limited. And, you know, sometimes these payloads can be quite large, especially for streams. So, you know, some of this, I know this is a long ago conversation, was like, to what degree are these things guarantees versus guidelines? Like, how far do we want to go on making these a enforced constraint versus something that is an option for a server to decide?
I think this is a nice spec. I mean, I'm predominantly a server guy. I have been a UI guy, and I think this feels nice. This feels good as an overall thing. So I'm not opposing it at all. But if we leave it gray area, that will leave room for confusion and misunderstanding. What if the client can't handle it, but the server outputs it in whatever order, or the other way around, expects something that doesn't happen? Things become murky in that area. So I usually prefer hard specs because they will determine what it is, or we're gonna have to end up doing the same thing, like what are the server features or server abilities? Does it do this or does it not do this, and stuff like that?
An example of what I mean is, say we decided, counter to what Rob is proposing here, and we said, hey, we want to actually squeeze out the last bit of performance, and streams can stream out of order, deferred fields can be sent down before their parent is ready in those edge cases, and it's up to clients to handle that complexity. Would it be okay then in that case for a server to decide, I'm not even going to bother preparing this nested field until the top one is prepared, because it just determines itself that it thinks it can tweak performance that way? So that's what I mean by like defining like a minimum set of constraints, and then saying like what is then in the server's capability. Is the server required? If a child field can be prepared earlier than its parent, is the server required to send it down as soon as possible, or is it allowed to wait? So that's all I mean about you know, one space of this is like flexibility for the server to make.
I'll tell you one adjacent concern that might impact the server implementation. Before I started reading about GraphQL, I actually hoped it addresses this. It doesn't, but in it's about delivering this, what is the same entity or object on the server side multiple times because it's nested multiple times in different contexts. If the server has it, and if it is the result or the future or whatever, the actual promise of any deferred thing, in order to reduce the server resource utilization, it might just say, here, you need this in these 100 places, just go, get rid of it. But otherwise, it wouldn't be able to do this if it has to wait for some parents or whatever, right?
Yep. That's maybe why getting the constraint right here could be important. I mean, we could always revisit it. Should we later? We've had that conversation before of having an actual graph payload rather than a tree payload. One of the early contributors to GraphQL called it TreeQL because they thought it was unfair that we called it graphs because really we just get to query and return trees.
Speaking honestly, there's no Q either there.
TreeL. Yeah, let's be honest. If we ever want to come back to that, then we'd want to make sure whatever constraint we describe here is generalizable. So, you know, the previous ones we've done there is having sort of like a side load of objects, like a denormalized graph with links. We could always come back to that again. I think like even in that mode, the constraint as I described it before might be the right one. And Rob, it sounds like you agree that's the way you'd want to phrase it, that you can't send a deferred payload unless the path at which it would be merged is already realized by the client via previous payloads. So you could imagine in a world where we sent a normalized graph rather than a tree, the path would be into that normalized graph. It would be like, you know, whatever objects, some, you know, identifier, and then like the field name. And if the previous bit there wasn't described, then like, you'd be stuck in the same position, which might get around to like, if there's some circuitous path by which you get to that thing that hasn't been loaded yet, then like maybe that thing could be.
Yeah, I think that's a more
loaded.
complex discussion because GraphQL has evolved a little past that point because we can have different renderings of the same object with different aliases and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it gets messy really quickly.
That is the primary reason why we didn't end up doing that the last time we had that conversation. Aliases.
Yeah, the constraint, what you said is if the path is there, isn't exactly what it's implemented as, because I'm not saying that if the path becomes available by a fragment that's not a parent of the one that's deferred, it can wait for that, because I think that would require understanding the whole like tree of fragments.
But
that makes sense.
But that shouldn't be a problem, Omet. I mean, essentially, at least for us, it was not a problem. You essentially get rid of the fragments when you're processing this. You're just preserving the deferred fragment. So if now one of the deferred fragments comes earlier but patches in the same structure that you already can patch in the client, it should just work fine.
So is that example C in the document?
Yeah, it's an example where let me check. Is it C? Yeah. Yes, it's essentially C, where you don't know if which fragment come first. See?
I'll put it this way too. I think that if we do defers this way as proposed, it does not prevent let's say, unsafe, just get it to me as quickly as you can, another similar defer or similar directive, or at least an argument for it later. So I don't think this is nailing it down forever, whichever way. I think we're good.
Okay. Rob, I know you want to talk through a couple of these, so maybe extra feedback should go to this discussion, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, just before we move on, I think we in agreement that it should not just be a free-for-all, that they can go in any order, but there should be some ordering. And
That's my
Right.
feeling.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so the next issue was the validation for initial count on the stream directive, which was originally brought up by Benji, that we do not have a validation rule for it. And this kind of goes into another topic that has been discussed here and there I've seen, where validation rules are only applied on both the query and the schema, not on the entire request, including variables, because that is what lets you, for example, validate persisted queries at the time of their persistence and not on every execution. So when you have a, the original ask is, why isn't there validation if you pass an invalid number like -1? So if you have a case where that's being passed as a variable, it's not possible to validate that with the current way that we're doing validation. Benji suggested just treating them as 0, and that's my gut of where I want to go to, because it seems like addressing the issue of validation with variables is a larger concern.
I don't want to cross the line where validation requires the variable values to be provided, because a lot of services will do validation statically. They'll do it at the time of query check-in, at which point you don't know what any one particular query would be. So like, I think the appropriate way to interpret validation is generalized across all possible input values. Like you gotta make sure that the query is valid for that. You could of course have a sort of partial solve here with the validation rule, that if your initial count is a fixed value, it's not a variable, then like, of course, statically, then you know what that is, and you could throw a validation error. That's not unreasonable.
Can't we have the input validation in general that you mentioned? I would really like to have that instead, and just apply it in a standard way throughout. Essentially, let's say have integer range, subtypes, and whatnot. Say anything positive or whatever.
Yeah, we don't have that now, and I think it's outside the scope of this. I basically heartily agree with Benji here that it's outside the scope of this proposal to solve how do you deal with negatives in a field that can't take negatives for that argument value. And it's fine to leave like static validation that Lee is proposing is like being the partial solution up to basically tooling implementers. So like, yeah, I'm responsible for static client-side validation in like my code base. If I really care and I see this happening a lot, yeah, I'll throw up a rule for it. But I think it would,
I don't think it's crazy to add this as a spec validation rule. We'd want to make it clear that it's like it is incomplete. Like you have to also do runtime validation, but it seems to be a value add to say like, if I wrote out a literal -1 an initial count, that just immediately causes an error rather than waiting for you to run the query. That's statically known, and it seems like we could do that. But if you did that, then I think Benji's suggestion here is probably the wrong one, that like it wouldn't make sense to fail a literal at validation, but then allow a variable value through by coercing it and then continuing to execute normally. Like you'd want consistent behavior. So my suggestion, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I didn't know that you could.
So my suggestion, regardless of whether we add a validation rule or not, is actually a runtime error. Like if a negative value is kind of never the right thing, then it's best to throw. And like, I don't know, maybe someone fat fingered a negative sign and didn't mean to, and it's not that they've just got a -1, it's got like -3 and they actually wanted 3, or they did some math to compute that and like forgot to call absolute value on it or something stupid. If it blindly just works, but it like blindly works by giving them 0, like that might be a surprising result, and it's probably a better developer experience to throw, even though that's annoying.
Yeah, that's what I
think
meant in the comments. Was it feels fishy that we don't validate that, and but it's a new situation with the old ones, like with skip and defer, with skip and include. We essentially can very easily validate them. If it's not a Boolean, we just throw a pathing, a syntax error or something, a validation error. But here it's actually, we would need to put that into the runtime to validate if it's wrong or not.
I think the server has to, the service has to validate one way or another. I mean, that's its business. And yeah, some servers don't, but they get into trouble, and that's a whole different ballgame. But in terms of validation, I think that GraphQL needs to remain relatively simple and succinct. We don't want to have a gajillion different things doing the same thing in different places if we don't have to. I think that way. And if we could say, if we could provide information at the schema level that something's supposed to be, let's say, positive, not zero even, then it doesn't say that tooling has to implement it. It doesn't say that the client has to validate it. It doesn't even say that the server-side framework that the server is using to parse GraphQL has to validate it. It just it's an indicator for documentation for those clients that can actually make use of it. It's a hint more than a requirement. And I think it's a useful one at that. If we could have that type of stuff, it would be awesome. I would love having that.
Rob, do you feel like you have consensus on that your initial proposal here of basically putting it in the, making sure we have runtime validation, but not worrying for now about making sure we have static validation? Is that the consensus that you agree with?
Where would the runtime validation actually live?
Yeah, that's what
exactly. That was the question.
That's runtime validation. I think you'd want to do this as part of the spec, right? Like wherever it is that you are writing the rules for what @stream means, and therefore wherever you're writing the rules for where initial count is being taken into consideration, you'd want a line there that says assert initial count is a 0 or a positive integer. And then like that throws an error. You can define what you mean by assert.
Does that mean that it's like the stream field returns null and has an error in the errors property, but the rest of the data is resolved because it had already started executing?
I think so. You probably want to explore and make sure that the behavior makes sense. But my intuition is that, yes, like this would result in a error originating at this field that was marked with @stream. And then at that point, typical error behavior should occur. So if it's nullable, then we just knock it out with null. There's no stream there. And if it is non-nullable, then it bubbles.
Just as a minor comment on this, and I may be incorrect, but I think that we only have asserts on things that occur just before actual execution occurs, i.e. no resolvers have been called at that point.
It's
that implementation specific?
Sorry, I mean in the GraphQL spec itself.
Yeah,
the term assert in the spec.
Yeah, we have the it's happening in the coerce argument value. So, and that's only when before we execute it, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we also have it when we do for the subscription root level field that we determined that we need to get the event stream from. We also do it for that as well, I believe. We assert that it, I forget what we assert, but we assert something there. But that again is before any resolver is actually called. But I would be hesitant about adding an assert that happens after any resolvers would be called. And here we're talking about throwing an error from the field. So basically, my issue is with the term assert, and maybe we should explicitly use a different term.
That's fine with me.
I think it's also fine in the, I don't think that we need to like block @stream. It's fine if it blows up the entire query as soon as the server sees it, as opposed to returning any results. right? That might actually be really good behavior, because then like as soon as you send the query, you get immediately feedback. Hey, I put in the wrong argument.
Yeah,
I
agree with that.
But do you want to do another validation after the variable coercion that essentially traverses the tree and then checks?
Yeah. Whichever, basically my attitude here is whichever is easier to do in the actual spec text is probably fine in either way, although it might be nicer if it blew up the query immediately, but if that's hard to do because we haven't hit it yet, that's probably fine too.
I think that the spec can specify the latest time that it has to be validated, but not necessarily the earliest. Let's say I'm implementing my own server right now. I'm using a library that does not have support for this to parse out GraphQL requests. Well, guess what? It does most of the things for me, but it won't do this. So it'll have to rely on my code happening later to barf out. And in that sense, it will come later, even though I personally also agree with Matt. I would love to fail fast because people may actually not notice these issues. Even if we return errors, they might be ignored. And then they won't know that they actually have trouble and the things they're not getting data. So sometimes failing fast and furiously is useful.
So I don't think that's actually a viable option because it could be streamed within a defer. So you might actually already start sending the response to the client before you ever hit the stream and then find out you should never have sent that in the first place.
So if we do a validation rule here, it must be, if we look at the executing requests, then it must happen after the coerced variable values. But that would be something new to do a query validation and take variables into account.
Yeah, I'm hesitant about this. Like, of course, I agree with the general principle. The earlier you get your error, the better. But I worry about a inconsistency where, because this would be a new thing, the only thing that would use this new thing would be the stream directive, and there's no way to extend that new thing into user code. So like, okay, really like at the base, what we're talking about is this initial count argument is taking a subtype of int called positive int, and like that's not a thing that our type system recognizes. If it was, all of our existing mechanisms would already work here. But what if there was some user provided field that was deep in the thing that said, hey, actually I have like the type that I want here is a positive int. Like stream's initial count can do that. Why can't I do that? I want to assert my field is correctly supply the right values long before I get there. Right now, that's not how that works. Right now, and like that's just one case. We do others where you got to match a regular expression or whatever. Any arbitrary logic can happen within that field to say like, oh, actually, like there's been some incorrect input here that's beyond what the type system described. I think we'd want to keep consistency there just so that we don't end up with like two different ways in which you can get input errors coming from the variables you've created and passed down into fields or directives. Yeah, so I don't know. I think I favor consistency here over early errors. Also, practically, I suspect while there may be cases where your stream is like deeply nested into your query somewhere, I suspect that the vast majority of cases will be a top level field which gets streamed, and therefore like the large majority of these kinds of errors will actually be caught quite early.
So,
yeah.
But you said, just to clarify here, so you would favor a runtime error when we use the arguments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, at whatever the point, like if we were going to follow Benji's proposed piece here, at some point you have to take the negative value and turn it into a 0. Wherever it is that we would do that, I'd say I'm not particularly in love with the idea of killing on a negative and interpreting as 0. I'd rather just do an error. Yeah,
I like that more. I like that more because I think just transforming the value is wrong, and we're just interpreting it as the default as 0. that feels wrong.
Are there any other cases where the executor can do a runtime error like this that nulls out the field?
Well, you technically can do it as part of the field resolver. The thing that's kind of weird here is that it's happening as a directive as opposed to like the field's arguments, right? Because I can always have a field where the argument, when it's negative, I throw an error.
Right.
But why is that an issue? I mean, yes, it can happen at the level of field resolver, but before it comes to that, something has looked at the actual entire request.
There's other precedent. If you just search through the spec for the word throw, and you'll find cases. The first one that I came across was result coercion. So say your field resolver returns a string, but your field was typed int. That's going to cause an error. That's not an error thrown by user code. That's an error thrown by the spec's defined definition and therefore the engine. And so I think there's a couple of cases where we throw field level errors. And to Benji's point, we don't call it assert. We call it, quote, throw a field error. And that field error is well defined and it is aligned to a field and it bubbles.
Yeah, that was my main issue, is it's a field error, not a request error. And I wanted to make that very clear because I don't think it's actually a validation rule at all.
Okay, I'm happy with that.
Yeah. I'm also.
I'm loose on the validation part. I think that would be a nice to have, and also designing for the 90% case. 90% of these are going to be top level fields with a subset being nested within. 90% are going to have an initial count as a literal value rather than a variable, with the long tail having a variable. So if you were to smush those two together, I suspect the vast majority of these stream cases are going to be some top level field, which needs to be streamed, where it's hard coded. I want the first three. And I don't know, maybe no one will ever hard code a negative value. And this is just over engineering, but if we wanted to give an early indication, doing that via validation rule, I don't know, it doesn't feel like a cost to me. It feels like value. The cost is spec complexity or writing extra shit. Anyhow.
Okay. The next one, stream on scalar lists. The spec says that data should be a map, I believe. And the question is, if you're streaming a scalar list, is it okay that data is also a scalar? I think it makes sense that it is. For me, it was not clear in the spec, but that's how it has been implemented and unit tested in the reference implementation since the beginning.
You're assuming that the server will stream one by one. Why not chunk by chunk?
No. It's about the structure of the result. And my remark to this was just we haven't implemented that in Hot Chocolate yet, that it can be a scalar, because we need to either state that it can be, or say that it can't be and has to be differently webbed or is not valid on scalar lists. Because we kind of said we're using the same structure with data, and at the moment the spec states it's a map, and either we break that up or we define that it has to be somehow put in a map in some way or something like that.
I think we actually could clean up the spec itself here a bit and say that data for a normal query or for a normal response, data is the type of the root, the root type, or the query mutation subscription, which is always a map. But when data is the type of the type that it's returning. When it's an object, that is a map. When it's a scalar, it's a scalar. And
when it's a list, why would it not be a list or a sublist?
This is.
It could, yeah. If you defer a field that's going to return you a list, then your data property here would be an array type or a list, whatever your list Right.
Same thing if you were to stream a doubly nested list.
Yeah.
It would be a list.
I think this is right in the spirit of time. Maybe we should do overviews of these because I know we're going to run out of time. This seems right to me. I'll just give you the historical context. Why we say data is a map type is because like right now that's always true. And sometimes the spec is redundant for the reason of giving extra information about what to expect. So like it's always a map type because you're always querying against the top level query, which is always an object. But it seems like we should be able to refine that statement to make this work.
I think that was always true because there was no deferral. With deferral, you're deferring something inside nested, which might not be an object anymore.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, so we just state that it can be whatever it is. So it can be a scalar when we have a scalar value, and it can be. I just wanted it to be stated in a spec because at the moment we don't have that, and that's a change. So that's the only agreement I want to have on that.
I just think that yes, it should be stated, but we need to be cautious about what is if we're deferring a list of scalars, then is data the scalar or still a list?
This is specifically for stream, but yes, in the case of stream. In case of stream, a scalar list will give you data as scalars. That's the spec right now.
Okay.
Yeah, the rest of them, I don't want to talk about the rest of them in as much depth as the previous ones. I still want to do more research on the rest of these, but I'll just do a quick overview, and it would be great if you have opinions to leave comments on the discussion. So this it was talked about a couple times. Is how does defer work when you have multiple mutations in an operation? If you look at this query, normally if result A is going to be resolved before mutation B starts, if this field is deferred, how is that handled? You can't resolve this first and send the initial payload that has mutation B. It's like a chicken and egg problem of which comes first. Does defer just get ignored here? I don't think that's great because I think that it's useful to do that. Do we make an exception that when it is deferred, result A could be executed after mutation B has started? And this goes if this is like a very deep nested field or something.
This actually ties to my my bit as well. I think this is a general issue that we have with GraphQL, a number of us at least that I was able to find out. I don't know what to say. I mean, I threw in some ideas in my presentation, but I think we have to answer this better than just answer it for defer specifically one way or another.
I'll leave this at that and invite everyone to leave comments on the discussion. And
I'll just give you my 2 cents before we move on, so I don't forget. But my opinion here is that option 2 is the right thing. Like the intent with option 1 is to avoid confusing results, where if you had omitted any kind of defer statement here and you queried result A twice, you would want to get its value with like each incremental thing applied. If you have an explicit defer, it seems reasonable to me to suggest that you would want to wait for that to resolve after all mutations have been applied. And like that seems like a reasonable thing for people to opt into. Anyway,
actually, I'd like to ask a question. I didn't see this in the spec, but I must admit that I may have missed it somehow, somewhere. We do say that mutation fields are supposed to be executed serially, which is a topic that I'm talking about. But the other question is, we can have actually, I realized that actually recently, I was surprised by it, that we can have multiple mutations blocks inside the same request. How do they relate to one another? Can they be executed concurrently, or are they supposed to be sequential as well?
Only one operation can ever be executed at a time, regardless of whether it's a mutation or a query.
Okay.
Benji put up, don't allow @stream/@defer on anything except query operations and address it later. I would be totally down with that resolution for now.
Me too. Me too. And I think I stated
come back.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, the thing is with like, especially with relay, where kind of the pattern that it's encouraged is that you execute a mutation and then spread your fragments for components underneath it to refresh all your data. Those components may have deferred stream on them because they, you know, and now you have to synchronously render them all when you didn't necessarily have to, especially if it's like a large fragment with a lot of.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I guess the attitude would be, we definitely need to resolve this, but do we need to resolve it to get to stage? Are we in stage 2, stage 3?
No, stage 1.
Okay, do we need to resolve this to get to stage 2, or can we defer this as like, yes, this needs to be resolved. This needs to like be fast resolved, but happens in another RFC track almost that's dependent on this one.
We could move the proposal forward by deciding this is not a problem we want to solve right now. But I think Rob's point is a salient one, and the fact that QA and Jafar have already gone down option 2 here should be strong signal that consumers of GraphQL want that behavior. And I think it'd be pretty confusing if you said we ship this feature and then all of a sudden you can't use it because of that single constraint.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you would so option 2 means also that we put defer on the top level. So we essentially can defer mutation A and it's actually executed after B.
Well, that's a separate issue that we have open, which I'm very happy saying you can't defer like the actual mutations to corrected fields. I think if we're doing option B on the other one, that makes total sense here, because benefits of that are way less clear to me than having fragments tied to components deep in your tree that you're including on a mutation.
That is the one I was worried about, that you could defer the top level, because that would it would become totally unclear when we execute which mutation then.
Totally agree. Rob, I'm sorry to have to cut this conversation short. I know there's a ton of stuff. I think the remaining action here is to ask folks to dig into the repo that Rob's put together with all these open discussions and weigh in. I do want to make sure we save a little bit of time for Alex at least to get through his PowerPoint, if not to have some discussion after that, since we're a lot less than 15 minutes he asked for. But thanks for this. You've made a ton of progress. I want to say that the mode in which you're working through, this is by far the most complicated RFC to hit GraphQL since its inception. I think that's pretty clear. Maybe close second would be subscriptions. And setting this up as a separate repo with discussions, I think, is a very fantastic way to go about keeping track of all these open issues. So thanks for being very well organized.
Thanks.
All right, Alexander, it's yield the floor to you.
Yeah, let me play from start. I'll share my screen. Oops. I lost my Zoom. Just give me a moment. I've got 3 screens and they keep. Oh, there it is. That one. excuse me if I use the logos inappropriately. I didn't end up removing them, but the logo is not the point. It's just there for. Do you see my screen, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. So so far, most people seem to be developing it this way and assuming it that way and suggesting that way or advising against anything else. But this is not the only way that that this is done. I found quite a few implementations documented online that actually say that we should not do mutations just at the root level, that we should allow nested mutations because they help. And I tried to just very quickly identify some problems that those of us who I guess sit on the other side of this face. We face namespace explosion. I have in the product that I'm developing over, well, hundreds of types. They have many fields. The product is complex. This is not a question of microservices that some people propagate. This is a box that people buy, that people put in their on premises, and they actually run that and need the API. So this is a massive, massive API that would literally need tens of thousands of kinds of root mutations if I were to restrict this as just root mutations. Or there's the other way of doing it, which is just to complicate the input big time to be able to express anything. But at that point, it becomes one massive mutation that just has this massive input that can mutate anything, which is, again, beats the point the other way around. So there's another issue beyond the namespace explosion, and this is re-specification of the context. So whenever you specify these individual mutations that go one after another, you have to re-specify usually the context or the parent or whatever they apply to, even if they apply to the common thing. And then this is on the server side, mainly. There's a lot of validation that we need to perform. And it helps to do a lot of this validation sort of at the right time. If we only have root mutations, we can only do individual root mutation validations, and then we have to wait until the very end, until all of these things are done, to composite them and look at the whole picture and see how that changed, which we have to do anyway, but it doesn't give us any place in between to say, okay, these bunch of changes or this scope is done, and now I want to validate just that. So the question is, why are we not having concurrent mutations, and what says that? And it's not really the data model, because the data model can be structured such that root mutations, non-root or nested mutations or concurrent mutations in this case make sense. For example, in this case, I'm showing two updates, one to checking account, another to savings account. These are just stupid examples, but they work. I mean, these are completely independent, and there's no impact at all as to whether you do one first or the other first. The outcome will be exactly the same. And while this is not always true, and we've seen some examples of that in the previous presentations in this very meeting, it is often true, and it is often true in my case as well. So right now, I can't necessarily do anything about that because the spec says, no, I have to execute them sequentially, because the client might actually rely on that fact for whatever reason, and I'm advised against actually solving my problem, which I'll paint later. So essentially by allowing what you will see coming up. So in any case, what actually sort of may happen anyway, and this is who actually has control. The server, yes, we are telling the server to implement mutations sequentially, or to execute them sequentially. But the point is that the server has a tough job anyway. It has to accept many requests at the same time, coming from many sources anyway, and has to be able to comply with them. Many of these requests actually can come from the same source, from the same user, from the same session, all at once. It is quite possible, and it happens. So it's still the server that has to somehow rely or figure out how to do these without exploding. And the client has to also know to a reasonable extent as to what it wants to accomplish and or not, and what order of things makes sense to it. Does it want to travel to city A first or city B first before it gets to C, and so on and so on. So the clients are actually aware of the ordering, and they might want a certain order for some things that are interdependent, but for things that are not, we are sort of presenting a roadblock here. Not necessarily a roadblock, but we're advising people not to do this, and some are ignoring that advice. I haven't gotten to that point yet, so I'm not ignoring it or not. I'm just hoping that we unplug it, but I've seen implementations that I like that do something differently. So this is how I see GraphQL. I like GraphQL because it brings clarity. It makes it clear as to what the server can do, what it needs to be able to do that, and the clients can actually be clear about what they want so the servers can properly serve them, not do any extra stuff, not do stupid stuff. It's just there, it's just right. So I accidentally dropped this respectful API, kind of play words on RESTful API. But it is that, and that's just my own personal view. So whether somebody actually thought of that or not, that's how I feel about it. And this thing sort of flies in the face of it. This is what I want to have, and this is in line with a lot of, a number of implementations that I found, which is essentially to say, look, I'm giving the context. In this case, I want to update the customer. This is actually really not doing anything on its own. It could be doing something. Let's say in some implementations, it can do something with basic properties, with scalars and whatnot. But ultimately, it's providing context for the inner nested additional mutations that can actually now say, well, I'm working within that guy. In that sense, the namespacing happens sort of naturally. This is the update checking of the update customer, not of something else or somebody else. So the namespacing is fine. I don't have thousands of root mutations. I just have essentially update for each type that I have or the context that I have. And then inside of it, I have whatever is relevant in there. So it's clean. The input types are simplified because each input type here doesn't have to be this monstrosity that can accept the entire schema or everything that you can reach from these points. It just needs to specify the things that that particular tiny atomic mutation actually can handle. And because of that, mutations become simple. They are elementary and you can actually combine them. I don't have to come up with every possible combination of these sometimes, which I don't have. I do have some handmade canned mutations, if you wish, that are good for a lot of things. But I can't give you canned mutations for hundreds of types that have tens of thousands of possibilities there or more. So I have to give my clients the ability to combine these elementary mutations into something more. So how is this actually supposed to work? Something like this. This is actually how the server would do it. Anyway, my experiments go this way. This is what happens even if you're not actually coding specifically for this, but you have layers in between your code and the database anyway, which is, well, you're fetching your customer anyway. You need to do that, whether you're doing this sequentially or not. There might be some locking involved. I'm not saying database locks, and there might be in-memory synchronization and semaphores and whatnot. And these guys now can happen in multiple threads concurrently or not. If they did, if they were implemented concurrently, they would have probably have some locks anyway, which would mean that they will happen in some order, whatever that order is, if they're not related to one another. And the server could know, actually, you know what, these things do depend on one another. So maybe I'll obey the order from the client or whatnot. There's a lot of things there. Once this is done, we're coming back. This is the finalization that I was talking about. I can actually look at the whole thing, these nested bits that were done for this particular customer, let's say in this case, and have some fraction of the big validation, if you wish, or actual database statements or whatever I want to do after this before I get to the root level again and do more mutations. So it's useful in that respect. And then what spec changes are required? I mean, this is my comprehensive list, this empty space here. It's more about, the spec says that these have to be sequential. The spec does not say that these inside ones have to be sequential. That's fine. But very often we're saying, and we're seeing and hearing people say, you know, but this is dangerous. You shouldn't do this because GraphQL doesn't specify what this order is. And I'm saying, so what? Let it be. I mean, if this is what the server says and allows, sure, that means that the client cannot rely on this particular order. And if it wants some particular order, it will have to break things up. So what are we doing here? I'll like break things up in multiple different queries. Calls, mutations. So to just run this very quickly, these are desired changes. These are not my official proposals. Think of them as crazy brainstorming ideas, and you will see that I tried to make them a little bit of funny kind of sort of way. So there is an impact on defer and stream, as I noted, but I think we need sort of good guidance and documentation, and not say just don't do this. Just saying be careful because this is what it means, and if you want to accomplish something in order, you have to do it in some other way, and so on and so on. The only thing that might be needed sort of is to not say that mutation is followed by a fetch necessarily, because, well, guess what? Mutation might be followed by another mutation in this case. We would want to have some sort of ways for schema to, or desire to specify this behavior. It isn't required immediately. And perhaps for the clients to request ordered execution, which is actually similar to some of the RFCs that already exist. I think operation execution or something like that is what one is called. In any case, one of the stupid ideas or crazy ideas, just simply say that a field is able to run things sequentially inside of it. This is not a serial type like I've seen a lot of people mention. This is a serial field, because this allows a little bit more of the type reuse. If you have shared types across multiple services that are federated, you might have services that can handle some things and others that can't, that cannot sequence their operations. And in this case, it's sort of funny that we have to say, yeah, well, I can do things sequentially, when in fact, probably many servers will do this sequentially anyway. It's because the spec is the other way around, and it's by default implying that things can be done concurrently. And this is simply telling the client, yes, you can actually rely on this order. You don't have to break up these requests in any sort of other way. If you just put them in here, I will execute them sequentially if you say so, perhaps. And then the question becomes, how do we say so? Again, a crazy idea here. Instead of using the typical braces, use the square brackets, sort of an array syntax that implies order of sorts. It is relatively simple. It does have the syntax impact that I sort of had a problem with as well. So this is my own red flag, if you wish. But it does solve a problem that directives alone would bring, which is if a client requests a sequential execution and the server does not actually support it or cannot guarantee it, it has to error out somehow. Something has to cause the failure. and this will cause the failure in the parser if it actually happens. So that solves that. But there's something better. The other way, and this is similar to deferring talk that we're talking about, but it's not really deferring any outputs. It's just deferring how things are happening in there. It's just saying, well, you know what, this foo thing, it actually depends on some syntax. Insert your own idea here. This is just a way of doing it. Depends on bar. And when you have that, you have relinquished your reliance on the default order, at least for foo, and the order will happen. Bar will execute first, and then foo will execute later. In here, I just use the variable syntax. There's a dot in there, which would barf otherwise. I mean, we can figure out something else, maybe $, maybe something else, doesn't really matter. It could be a string, but if it's not a string, it could be validated by the clients better, and so on and so on. So it might be better that way. And there's something even better than that. And again, this is not a natural progression necessarily. This is just showing you how things can evolve over time, perhaps, which is saying, why not allow the output of one query, or mutation in this case, to be used as an input in another. I've had from my own clients a number of demands like that because I didn't expose queries full power everywhere, and they would like to be able to find something and then apply a mutation to that, for example. And this something simple like that would actually be able to solve that. This brings us to the server functionality or features or abilities question. Again, these are just stupid ideas. I just wanted to bring attention to them. I'm not saying that it should be any specific way, but we need to identify somehow to the client that it is okay for it to actually use some of these features or some of these enhancements, or that it can rely on them because the server will be able to obey them. And this would also in turn tell federation or anything else like that what it can do, where it can break things up, and that's it. So that is my presentation. I tried to go through it quickly. There is a Markdown document that sort of documents these same things that I just spoke about, well, in text, in a little bit more detail perhaps than I showed, but in a more boring fashion. And I wanted to kickstart this discussion and have this progress somehow, however this progresses with you guys in Graphql working group, because I believe this is very important. It was important enough to have these guys document something related and expose things their own way and whatnot. So I'm not alone. And there's a lot of benefits to this. I understand that it can sound scary, but it's not complicated. It doesn't need to be scary. The clients can still work the exact same way that they do today. And if they want something to be done in order, they can actually do it one way or another already. But unplugging this nested mutation things would be really useful for us guys who have tons of types and properties in them, or fields if you wish, and operations that we can do on them to actually manage our schemas. Go ahead,
Alex. I know we're way over time, so a bunch of our participants have already left. I want to make sure that we have a space to continue this. I opened up a discussion thread in the working group channel. It's not an issue, but a discussion. Hopefully that makes it a little easier to fork this out, because there's a lot going on here. I want to make sure people have the opportunity to weigh in. So I dropped a link in the chat, but also find it there in the discussions thread. And then also make sure you dig up the historical context. As you can imagine, it's not the first time we've talked about this. I think Oleg opened one about namespaces like 3 or 4 years ago. That's probably where the bulk of this past discussion happened. But yeah, welcome the the discussion on this. I think it'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
And we are 10 minutes over time, so I'll make the wrap up brief. Thanks everybody for joining. We covered a lot of ground today, so thank you all for your participation. And I hope everybody has great winter holidays, and we'll see you all in the new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you next year.
Guys,
See ya. Bye.